This week marks 50 years since the SS Edmund Fitzgerald sank while crossing Lake Superior. The shipwreck, which killed all 29 men aboard, became the most well-known wreck to ever occur on the Great Lakes.
For 50 years, the Edmund Fitzgerald has been more than a shipwreck. It's been our greatest maritime mystery, a ghost story sung about and whispered over. What monstrous force could sink a giant so completely without a single cry for help? The official reports had theories, but the lake kept the truth locked in darkness. Now, for the first time, a daring mission has finally reached the wreck and captured it in stunning clarity. What they found solved a decades-old puzzle and revealed a truth more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The secrets buried in the deep are finally coming to the surface. Imagine the worst storm you can think of. Now imagine it on a lake so vast and cold, it feels like an ocean. This is Lake Superior in November 1975. For centuries, the Ojibwe people have called it Gichigami, the Great Sea. But on a night like this, it earns a darker and more chilling name. The lake that does not give up, it's dead. The water is so cold that bodies do not easily rise. The lake keeps them. It keeps its secrets. On the 10th of November, a giant moved among those monstrous waves, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. She was the titan of the Great Lakes, an immense freighter stretching 729 feet, launched in 1958 and hailed as the Queen of the Lakes. Built to carry taconite pellets, iron ore concentrate formed into dense spheres for the furnaces, the Fitzgerald was a workhorse of an industrial age. Fully loaded, her hull rode low as she pushed toward a steel mill near Detroit. At the wheel was Captain Ernest McSorley, a seasoned mariner who knew the lake's moods, shoals, and sudden gales. Forecasts warned of a fierce November storm. Winds rose to hurricane force, and waves built into walls, some over 7 meters high. The Arthur M. Anderson steamed a few miles astern, and the two captains kept in radio contact as visibility dropped to spray and night. At one point, McSorley radioed the Anderson, "We are holding our own." Those calm words proved to be the last clear sign. Then silence. Radar blips vanished, and the sea offered only wreckage and oil. Searchers battled white water and a weather that refused to be reasoned with. Divers and sonar later located the wreck about 160 meters down, broken in two. The forward and aft sections separated on the cold floor. 29 men were lost. The sight of the broken hull, lying silent beneath that inland sea, continues to haunt those who study it. Investigations proposed several possibilities. Massive waves might have smashed hatch covers, flooding cargo holds and removing buoyancy. Structural failure, metal fatigue, or shifted cargo could also have played a part. Official reports leaned toward progressive flooding compounded by storm damage, while mariners still debate other stresses and the speed of the loss. Taconite pellets were dense cargo. If water reaches the holds, the extra weight can change a ship's handling fast. With the Fitzgerald fully loaded, her freeboard was low, allowing waves to sweep the decks and test hatch seals. Lake freighters were fitted with heavy canvas and steel hatch covers, but repeated pounding could weaken even strong fittings. Several investigators noted seas washing over the deck, water pooling on hatch covers, and drains failing, and crews working desperately to clear it. The tragedy collapsed certainties. Here was an enormous ship, a practiced crew, and a lake that seemed to swallow proof. The Fitzgerald's loss became a community wound for lakeside towns and a national story of grief and puzzlement. Gordon Lightfoot's ballad, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, turned technical detail into a mournful myth. its chorus echoing the line that the lake never gives up her dead. The search after the loss became a vast operation. Coast Guard cutters, commercial ships, and aircraft combed the storm-tossed surface. Shorelines filled with anxious families listening to radio updates, and local communities held vigils for the missing. Memorials and museum exhibits later rose along the lakeshore to honor the men lost. The wreck itself has become a place of study and solemn remembrance, where science meets sorrow and lessons are learned. Yet the sinking prompted action. Scrutiny of hatch designs, weather forecasting, and safety routines grew. Lake shipping adopted stricter checks and improved communications. The wreck drew scientists and divers who sought evidence in the cold dark, treating the site with care and respect. On a November night in 1975, the lake took its due and left questions that still echo. After the storm passed and the terrible truth set in, the question remained: how do you solve a mystery that lies 530 feet beneath some of the coldest, most unpredictable water on Earth? The answer, in 1976, was to send in the pioneers. Just a year after the sinking, a team from the US Navy arrived with the best technology of the day. They used a sonar sled, a clumsy-looking device dragged along the bottom, and a small submersible called the Curve 3. It was a desperate, difficult search, but they found her. The first chilling confirmation: the Edmund Fitzgerald was not resting in one piece. She was broken in two, her stern section lying upside down, separated from her bow by a field of debris. The images they brought back were historic, but they were also deeply frustrating. They were grainy, dark, and ghostly. The sonar pictures were just vague shapes, outlines in the gloom. It was like trying to recognize a face by looking at its shadow. These first glimpses did one thing. They confirmed the ship's location and her tragic state, but they revealed almost nothing about why she broke apart. The lake had given up its dead, but it was still holding on to its secrets. In September of 1980, a famous name entered the story: Cousteau. Jean-Michel Cousteau, son of the legendary Jacques, brought his ship, the Calypso, to the site. The world held its breath. If anyone could unravel a deep-water mystery, it was the Cousteaus. They descended in a small two-man submarine, piercing the darkness for the first time with their lights. The mission was primarily to film a documentary, and the footage of the Fitzgerald they brought back was brief, just fleeting glimpses. It was tantalizing, but ultimately frustrating. They didn't learn much new about the cause of the sinking. They did, however, make a bold claim. The ship had broken in two on the surface, but with no way to verify it, the claim simply became another piece of the puzzle, another theory in a sea of questions. The hunt went cold for nearly a decade. Then, in August of 1989, a new, more determined team arrived with a new kind of weapon. This wasn't a manned submersible. It was a remote-operated vehicle, or ROV, an underwater robot connected by a cable to a ship on the surface. This was cutting-edge technology, and the team behind it was a who's who of experts from universities, government agencies, and historical societies. They were not there for film, they were there for forensic evidence. What this robotic explorer found was both incredible and deeply haunting. The cold, fresh water had preserved the wreck in an eerie state. There was still glass in some of the windows, but the most chilling discovery was a simple, open door on the pilot house. On a ship, doors are usually sealed shut or dogged against the weather. This one was open. It was a silent, heartbreaking detail that suggested someone, in those final desperate seconds, had tried to get out. It was a human moment frozen in time. The ROV's cameras also revealed something else. The damage to the bow was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. It was so severe that some experts on the mission felt it couldn't have been caused by the storm alone. Something else, something catastrophic, must have happened. Yet even with all this technology, a definitive answer still slipped from their grasp. They left with more haunting questions than they had arrived with, proving that the Fitzgerald was not yet ready to give up its deepest, darkest secret. For nearly 2 decades, the wreck yielded only echoes and guesses. Then, in 1994, a carefully planned expedition changed everything, at least at first glance. Great Lakes 94, organized by the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society and backed by the Canadian Navy, set out on a 6-week campaign across the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River under the scientific direction of Dr. Joseph McInnes. Tom Farnquist, executive director of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, joined the team, lending a steady hand steeped in local knowledge and years of study. Their goal was not theater, but evidence, to return clear images and measurements that might finally tell the Fitzgerald story. What they brought back stunned the public. For the first time, many people saw the wreck in detail. The bow, a mangled mass of twisted plates and torn hatch covers. The pilot house, almost eerily intact, windows staring into the black, and the lifeboats still lashed in their davits as though frozen in the moment the world ended. The sight of those tied-down boats hit hardest. It told a terrible truth at a glance. There had been no time to launch them, no organized lowering, no orderly evacuation. Men had been taken in minutes, if not less. That single image altered how people pictured those final seconds. Not a long, chaotic evacuation, but a sudden and ruthless end. Yet the images were masters of suggestion rather than proof. The ROVs and camera sleds used in 1994 were impressive tools for their era, but they came with hard limits. The remotely operated vehicles were large and cumbersome, with restricted agility and narrow fields of view. Their lamps created small cones of light that grazed only fragments of the wreck. Beyond those cones lay an abyss of black. The video was standard definition, grainy and prone to distortion when it swept across jagged metal. The machines could not thread the treacherous debris field lying between the separated hull sections, and they could not peer deeply beneath the overturned stern to inspect the inner hull plating. What looked like certainty at first became, with closer study, a catalogue of questions. Among those questions were 2 competing theories that rose to dominate technical debate. The first, often called the Three Sisters, or rogue wave hypothesis, proposed that a sequence of enormous waves, each towering like a multi-story building, had battered the Fitzgerald. In that account, waves overwhelmed the decks, swamped hatch covers and scuppers, and allowed water to pour into cargo holds loaded with dense taconite pellets. Once water pooled where it did not belong, handling would have been impaired, and the loss of buoyancy rapid. Under that scenario, the ship could have been overcome in minutes, leaving little time for a response. The second hypothesis pointed instead to a structural calamity caused by interaction with the lake floor. The 6-fathom shoal, a known shallow area of Lake Superior, lay along the Fitzgerald's track. Advocates of this idea argued the vessel might have bottomed out, striking or grinding the shoal during difficult navigation in the storm. Such contact could have torn plates or weakened framing, resulting in progressive flooding and ultimately catastrophic breakage that left the hull snapping in two. These theories were not mere academic sparring. Each carried different implications for ship design, cargo handling, and seamanship on the lakes. Great Lakes 94 had pushed technology to its limit and opened a window into the wreck, but that window framed only parts of the picture. The expedition proved the ship lay in two great sections and offered images that crystallized public grief and technical curiosity alike. It also underlined a frustrating truth about underwater forensics. More resolution creates more detail, and more detail often multiplies interpretations. The pilot house intactness, the lashed lifeboats, the twisted bow plates, each was a clue, but not a verdict. So the wreck remained a half-told story. Great Lakes 94 moved the debate from hearsay to evidence, yet it also showed how the lake's cold and darkness could preserve facts while simultaneously hiding the chain of events that led to the tragedy. For families and mariners, for scientists and divers, the Fitzgerald had become a locked book whose pages could be turned only slowly, with better tools and with patient, careful reading. The mission proved one thing without doubt. To solve the riddle would require time, humility, and technology yet to come. For the families of those lost with the Fitzgerald, the lake offered no gravesite to visit, only open water and a pain that would not be closed. In 1995, that ache found an answer in an extraordinary mission of remembrance and careful science. Coordinated by the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society and backed by an international team that included Canadian naval specialists and media partners such as the National Geographic Society, the expedition set out not to sensationalize the wreck, but to recover a single, deeply meaningful object, the ship's bell. The operation was technical theater. Teams embarked from a support vessel and lowered mini-submarines fitted with high-definition television cameras and powerful mercury vapor lights that turned the black undersea into a hard, artificial day. Divers worked not in normal suits, but in atmospheric systems, the newt suit being the most dramatic example. A one-man hard-shell apparatus that allowed a diver to operate at depth with near-normal mobility while remaining at sea-level pressure inside. In effect, these men worked like astronauts walking on an iron moon, manipulating tools through sealed gloves and relaying images and telemetry back to the surface in real time. On the 4th of July, 1995, a careful, surgical recovery was carried out on the pilot house at roughly 530 feet down. The bell itself weighed roughly 200 pounds, that's about 91 kilograms, and had been darkened by decades of sulfide and iron compounds. Retrieving it required steady hands, patient cutting of incrustation, and a lift that would not further displace fragile wreckage. Family members and representatives watched on board the support ship as the tarnished bronze broke the surface, an object retrieved from the sleeping world beneath in a moment heavy with sorrow and a kind of relief. Conservation followed with near religious care. The bell was transported to Michigan State University, where conservators deployed meticulous techniques to remove sulfide films and rust while preserving the bell's patina and inscriptions. Treatment included gentle mechanical cleaning, such as dental picks and soft brushes, aided by mild chemical baths. Formic acid washes were used in controlled steps to dissolve stubborn corrosion, followed by neutralizing rinses and stabilizing treatments to prevent future decay. The process was slow enough that one research associate is remembered for sleeping in the conservation lab to guard the bell and ensure continuity of care. Such vigilance demonstrates how an object can become a focal point for communal memory and scientific responsibility. Once restored, the bell assumed a dual role. The original went on permanent display at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point, a place already dedicated to remembrance and education. A carefully made replica, engraved with the names of all 29 crewmen, was placed on the wreck site to serve as a permanent on-site memorial for divers and the ROVs that visit the resting place. The replica honors the dead without disturbing the grave, while the original permits families, students, and visitors to see and touch an object of palpable history. Each November, the bell rings again. At the annual memorial on 10th November, it is sounded 30 times, once for each of the 29 men who perished, and a final resonant toll for all mariners lost on the Great Lakes. The ringing is both ritual and reckoning, a public act that turns an object recovered from cold darkness into a living vessel for grief, remembrance, and ultimately understanding. Through careful recovery and conservation, the bell transformed a placeless loss into a focal point of memory, science, and respect. We all know the song, we've all heard the stories, but what really happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald down there in the dark? For years, it was the greatest mystery the Great Lakes had ever known, and the only people who might have had the answers were a tiny group of explorers who did what seemed impossible. They went down and saw it with their own eyes, and what they brought back was haunting. This isn't just old news footage. We're talking about raw, unedited film from the final dives, hours of video that had been locked away for decades. This is the real deal, and it shows you just how terrifying it was to visit this shipwreck. Imagine sinking into Lake Superior. The light from the surface fades away until there's nothing, just you, in a tiny sub, surrounded by a blackness so complete it feels like you're in space. But it's not space. The pressure down there is crushing. One of the divers said that if he'd dropped his camera at just 300 feet, the water pressure would have instantly imploded it, turning it into a pile of scrap metal. Now remember, the Fitzgerald is resting nearly double that depth. This was a journey to the absolute edge. And because it's so deep and so cold, what they found was defrozen in time. This isn't some rusty, broken-down hulk being eaten by worms. The Fitzgerald is perfectly preserved. It's a ghost ship, sitting exactly as it landed on that terrible night. It's so pristine, it sends chills down your spine. But here's the thing. Finding the wreck was half the battle. The technology back in the 90s wasn't what it is today. Their sonar was basic. They couldn't just fly their sub right down to the deck. It was like trying to find your way through a pitch-black forest with a flickering flashlight. And sometimes they got lost. Can you imagine? Two different divers on two different expeditions told the same terrifying story. 1 minute, you're moving slowly through the endless gloom. The next minute, your lights suddenly reflect off a metal wall right in front of you. You jerk to a halt, your heart hammering in your chest, and you realize you're already inside the wreck. You've accidentally drifted straight into one of the cargo holds. You are literally inside the tomb of the 29 crewmen. That realization that you've trespassed on a gravesite without even knowing it, it changes you. It's a moment of pure, cold dread. These brave dives were all trying to answer one burning question. When did the ship break? Did the storm rip it in two on the surface? Or did it sink in one piece and shatter when it hit the bottom? By studying the brutal scars on the steel, the evidence started to point to a horrifying scenario. The ship was most likely caught between two monstrous waves, lifted in the middle until its back could take no more, and then it snapped in two on the surface under the fury of the storm. But here's the powerful part. Even the men who risked everything to uncover these clues now believe the story should end with them. They feel the lake has given up all the answers it's going to. The Edmund Fitzgerald has become more than a puzzle to be solved. It's a sacred memorial, a permanent resting place for 29 souls, forever preserved in the silent, dark deep. So, after all this time and all this technology, what have we truly learned? The story of the Edmund Fitzgerald is no longer just a single, simple question. The evidence paints a much more complex and terrifying picture. It wasn't just one thing that went wrong. It was a cascade of failures, a perfect storm of disasters piling on top of each other. A grounding that caused hidden damage, monster waves that battered the hull, and then the final brutal snap as the ship's back broke in two. The violence of those final moments, now seen with such clarity, is the true revelation. It was not a slow fading, but a sudden, violent end. But in solving this mechanical mystery, we must never forget the human heart of it. This was not just a ship, it was a home and a workplace for 29 men. They were fathers, sons, brothers, and friends. They were men who simply went to work one day and never came home. That is why this wreck site is so much more than a historical curiosity. It is a gravesite. The recovery of the ship's bell in 1995 transformed it into a permanent memorial. That bell, now displayed at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, carries a powerful inscription: "We ring for them and for all lost sailors."